Look at the door. It's closed, but the sound has already passed through the wood, penetrated the barrier. It's the doorbell, a sharp, insistent noise that's not just outside the house, but in your very core. The body reacts before consciousness can process the visitor's identity. A visceral contraction, a chemical recoil. There's a potential intruder on the threshold. Your hand freezes in midair. You tell yourself it's just the day's fatigue, the weight of the working hours, or that it's not a good time for socializing. You rationalize the aversion, cloaking it in the guise of social logistics. It's easier to blame tiredness than to face the truth. The ego's lie is always the same. The fault lies externally. The problem is the circumstance. But it's not tiredness. It's the shadow projecting an invisible fence, a psychic boundary that has just been violated. What you feel is not a character flaw, but the brutal activation of an autonomous complex. The unconscious is taking control of the situation, demanding integrity at all costs. It is manifesting a momentary psychic dissociation, where the deepest part of your soul screams, retreat. This is not about the visit, it's about the structure of your energy. Why would the mere idea of a social gathering in one's private space generate such revulsion? Modern man, especially the individual who still has some connection with his center, lives in a collective neurosis of adaptation. We are forced to simulate an extroverted enthusiasm that we do not possess. I was the first to popularize the terms extroversion and introversion, but they have been tragically simplified by popular culture. It's not about how well you smile at parties. It's about the direction of the flow of your psychic energy, your libido. The extrovert is nourished by contact, by external stimulation. The world, with its noise and complexity, is the engine that recharges their batteries. They expand outward. Interaction is their oxygen. The introvert, however, functions in almost the opposite way. Their source of energy, their wellspring, lies in silence, in introspection, in absolute solitude. They retreat inward, and it is in isolation that the soul manages to reorganize the raw materials of experience. When they are excessively exposed to the external world, unexpected visits, long conversations, interruptions in the internal flow, their mind not only tires, it begins to collapse. Not out of arrogance, but out of a structural psychological need. The key is this: disliking receiving visitors is not a social deficit. It's a direct expression of how your energy is organized. You are an individual whose libido flows inward. Your home is not just a physical place. It is a sacred space, a hermetic cocoon, a laboratory where the individuation process is underway. It is there that the psyche finds balance, where chaos is transformed into inner order. When someone crosses that threshold, even with the best of intentions, that person touches invisible threads that you've been adjusting all day. The mere presence of the other forces you to activate the persona, the social mask. And this persona, for the introvert, is a colossal energy drain. The soul has to divert precious resources, which should be nourishing the self, to sustain the facade of courtesy. The persona is necessary for social life, but it is, by definition, a partial betrayal of the self. It's how you negotiate with the world, but it's not who you truly are. And this act of deviating from yourself to entertain others is profoundly exhausting. Trying to go against this inner impulse, forcing sociability when the soul yearns for silence, only leads to conflict and neurosis. Introversion is not a conscious choice. It is not a whim. It is a disposition of the soul, a psychological destiny. What others perceive as coldness or disinterest is, more often than not, pure self-protection. It's a psychological shield, an invisible boundary erected by the unconscious to guard the inner core. And it is precisely within this boundary that the shadow acts. The shadow is not just the bad part of you, as many simplify it. It is everything you have suppressed. Aspects of your personality that were banished because they were socially unacceptable. Old fears, unresolved wounds. Imagine the scene again. The doorbell rings. You open the door. You sit down with the person, try to relax, but feel a growing discomfort. A strange irritation rises and you can't identify its source. The truth is that the presence of that person, their voice, the energy they carry, can unconsciously touch a blind spot in your psyche, an aspect of your shadow that you haven't yet had the courage to face. The visitor, unknowingly, becomes the catalyst that exposes what is hidden. What you don't bring to consciousness appears in your life as destiny, And sometimes this destiny manifests as social discomfort, a seemingly harmless visit that suddenly evokes a feeling of invasion, an almost physical urge to ask the person to leave. It's not disrespect. It's your unconscious trying to protect the integrity of your being. The shadow, however, doesn't only contain darkness. It also holds unlived potential, talents, and truths you haven't yet had the courage to embrace. The more you live on the surface, adapting, being polished, forcing social interactions to please the masses, the less space your soul has to breathe and perform its inner alchemical work. If you feel an overwhelming need to be alone, if the idea of receiving visitors overwhelms you, your shadow may be telling you, pay attention, you need silence, you need space, you need yourself. And listening to that voice, honoring that boundary, is an act of psychological courage. Do you know the relief of finally arriving home after a long day, the door closing, and the noise of the world silencing itself? In analytical psychology, the home is not just a brick shelter. It is a symbol of the soul. It reflects your inner state. When someone enters this space, they are not just entering your living room. They are entering your sacred territory. Home is one of the most powerful symbols of the self, the center of our wholeness, where healing and balance occur. Each room in the house symbolizes an aspect of the personality: the basement, the unconscious; the attic, the highest thoughts; and the front door is the boundary between you and the other. When someone crosses that threshold, their unconscious detects that an external energy, laden with thoughts, tensions, and complexes belonging to others, is penetrating the system. If you are on the path of individuation, if you are in a process of inner construction, this can be a burden. Protecting your home is protecting yourself. It is a central step towards psychic integration. You are not isolating yourself. You are honoring the temple where the soul resides. You are being the architect of ruins who needs to rebuild your own castle in peace. Have you ever found yourself smiling politely, offering coffee, engaging in small talk, while internally, your psyche screams for silence and seclusion? This is the exact moment when structural conflict manifests itself. The door opens and the self, the center of the whole, is forced to retreat, yielding the stage to the persona. The persona is the social mask, the functional complex we adopt to relate to the world. It's what society expects of us: the friendly host, the interested conversationalist, the individual perfectly adjusted to the rules of social interaction. But this persona is, essentially, a facade. It's not your truth. For the extroverted type, this social performance can be a feast. Energy flows from the outside in, and contact nourishes. But for the individual whose psychic libido moves primarily inward, the introvert, this acting is a hemorrhage. It is an energy cost that exceeds the benefit. Each forced smile, each polite question that does not resonate with inner truth, is a fragment of soul that is scattered. We're talking about signal degradation. Your inner truth, which is clear and concise in the silence of solitude, becomes static and distorted noise when it needs to be filtered by the social persona. The exhaustion you feel at the end of a visit is not merely physical, it's psychic. You're expending vital energy to maintain a structure that doesn't correspond to your developing self. The unconscious mind cannot tolerate this falsification for very long. And what happens when this mask is activated within your sacred territory? The shadow reacts. Remember, the shadow is the repository of everything we reject in ourselves. The primitive impulses, the unexpressed anger, the inadequacy, the condemned laziness. When a visitor arrives, they bring with them the possibility of being a mirror. The gaze of the other, even if benign, is a factor of pressure. And what does this mirror reflect? Not only your polished persona, but also the dark aspects you've tried to lock away in the basement of your psyche. The sudden and inexplicable discomfort that arises during the visit, that irritation that seems disproportionate to the situation, is often a projection. You are not irritated with the guests themselves. You are irritated with what they are unconsciously forcing you to see or feel in yourself. The visitor, with their alien energy, touches a blind spot, an autonomous complex that was at rest. Modern neurosis often manifests itself in the inability to tolerate the reality of the other, because the reality of the other threatens the fragile construct we maintain about ourselves. If you are not at peace with your own shadow, the presence of any stranger in your temple will be felt as an invasion. The individual undergoing individuation, the one becoming the totality they are destined to be, needs seclusion. The psyche, like nature, requires cycles. There is a time for interaction and a time for germination. Solitude forced by an aversion to visitors is not a symptom of misanthropy, but rather a defense mechanism of the self that demands space for internal alchemy. It is in silence that autonomous complexes can be observed without the interference of external noise. It is there that the architect of ruins can dismantle the old structures and draw the new map of the soul. If your biology demands the chemical signature of inner peace as a predator demands blood, you must honor that need. The price of failure is neurosis. Trying to be what you are not, sacrificing your core to maintain a social mask, is the direct path to psychic imbalance. Isolation, in this context, is an act of preservation. It is the psyche asserting its sovereignty, demanding time for the gestation of what is new and true. Do not dare interrupt this process. The closed door is the boundary of your sanity. The closed door, as I stated, is the boundary of your sanity. But the psyche is not content with just the physical limit. It speaks through symbols, and your dwelling, your house, is the primordial symbol of your inner totality. We do not see it as a mere structure of bricks and mortar, but as the temenos, the sacred space where the alchemy of the soul takes place. Every time your unconscious manifests in dreams, it uses the structure of the house to map the current state of yourself. When the doorbell rings, it's not just a body moving toward your living room. It's a strange energy clashing with the mandala you've carefully tried to arrange. The discomfort you feel isn't a character flaw, but the physiological and psychic reaction to the disruption of your inner cosmos. It's the numinous manifesting as repulsion, a warning that the integrity of your center is under attack. The unexpected visit, or even the expected one, forces the self to mobilize resources that should be dedicated to integrating the shadow. Inner work is suspended so that the persona can be activated and play its socially acceptable role. This interruption, this diversion of energy, is what generates exhaustion. It is the signal degradation that occurs when the transmission of an inner truth is forced to traverse the noise of social superficiality. What prevents him from simply closing the door and remaining silent? The fear of disapproval, the fear of being seen as the misanthrope, the weirdo, the individual who refuses to participate in the collective dance. When social tension becomes unbearable, the collective unconscious offers compensations. If you fail to recognize and honor your need for seclusion in waking life, the psyche will compensate in the dream realm. Observe the dream architecture of your home. Is it in ruins, invaded by strangers, or is it a solid and well-defended refuge? If your dream home is being ransacked, or if there are unknown figures wandering through your most intimate rooms, this is a symbolic representation of what is happening to your psychic energy. The visitor, in the dream, ceases to be the neighbor or the co-worker and becomes the archetypal invader, the figure of the shadow that tries to take possession of your center. The dream is brutally honest. It shows that by opening the physical door, you unconsciously opened a breach for other people's autonomous complexes, or even your own repressed aspects, to come to the surface. The presence of the other, out of harmony with your inner state, acts as a catalyst. It touches the sensitive point where the unhealed wound resides, the aspect of your shadow that you have not yet been able to face, and the immediate reaction is not one of pleasure, but of defense. The body reacts with the impulse to flee, the mind with irritation, because your integrity is being called into question. The individual who is progressing on the path of individuation develops an almost prophetic sensitivity to the quality of the energy that surrounds him. He cannot afford to be permeable to unnecessary external influences. Solitude at this stage is not a luxury, it is the raw material of transformation. True introversion, in the Jungian sense, is the movement of libido inward, where it encounters and negotiates with internal contents. This is hard work, comparable to the labor of alchemists. It demands focus, silence, and a controlled environment. Any interruption is a distraction from the great work. What appears to be coldness or disinterest is, in fact, the maximum concentration of psychic energy. A weak ego feels compelled to justify itself, to invent excuses, to force coexistence in order to conform to the collective ideal of sociability. But the self doesn't care about popularity. The self demands authenticity and the integration of opposites. If your nature demands introspection, ignoring this call is to live a life of lies, an existence of a distorted echo of your true essence. The psyche knows that every minute spent in empty conversations, in keeping the persona activated for a guest, is a minute stolen from the dialogue with the unconscious. It's a delay in the process of becoming who you truly are. Therefore, when the urge to say no arises, when the inner resistance is almost physical, don't repress it. Don't treat it as a moral failing. Treat it as an urgent message from your core. It is your biology, your soul, demanding the sterile and silent environment necessary for healing and growth. Protect your temenos. The outside world can always wait, but the work of building yourself cannot be interrupted. The closed door is your first act of courage towards wholeness. The door may be closed, the temenos protected, but the psyche is a battlefield where the boundaries are fragile. The individual who feels a violent aversion to external intrusion needs to ask, who is really feeling this aversion? Is it the conscious ego, or is it a psychic fragment that has been touched and is now active? We're not talking about bad manners or shyness. We're dealing with possessiveness. The unconscious is not a passive repository. It is a cauldron of energy. Within this cauldron reside the autonomous complexes. These are charged emotional cores, constellated by unresolved experiences, fears, traumas, frustrated expectations. The complex functions like a miniature personality, a ghost that lives in the hallway of your psychic house. It possesses its own will, its own memory, and crucially, it possesses its own libido. When the doorbell rings, when the external presence breaks the quiet of the sanctuary, this intrusion doesn't just affect the ego that's having coffee. It resonates directly with the most vulnerable complex. Imagine you are in the midst of dealing with the terrible mother complex, the need for external approval, the fear of being judged, the dread of criticism. You are isolated, trying to negotiate the release of this energy. Suddenly, an unexpected guest appears. He doesn't need to say a word of criticism. His mere presence is enough to reactivate the old pattern. The complex is activated. At this very moment, the ego is eclipsed. The psychic energy that should be under the control of consciousness is drained and hijacked by the autonomic complex. The individual who answers the door is no longer the totality of themselves. They are momentarily the voice and body of the complex. The complex, acting as an architect of ruins, takes control and reacts disproportionately. The irritation that arises is not a simple social annoyance. It is the manifestation of an inner power that does not tolerate being confronted. This is why the reaction seems so irrational, so visceral. The individual feels invaded not by the neighbor, but by their own inner demon that has been awakened. This is the true loss of soul in modernity. It's not a dramatic event, but a subtle and chronic dissociation. We lose pieces of ourselves to these autonomous fragments. When the projection complex, for example, is active, the person doesn't see the guest. They project their own unresolved shadow onto them. The discomfort is a smokescreen. It's not the other person who is the problem, but the shadow that the other person is, involuntarily, activating within us. Neurosis, as I see it, is the suffering of the soul that is being forced to live under the dictatorship of its complexes. The individual who withdraws and protects their space is not being antisocial. They are, often unconsciously, trying to avoid possession. They are trying to conserve the little egoic energy they have left for the essential work of integration. They know that if the complex is activated, they will spend hours or days trying to recover their stolen energy, fighting against an irritation that does not belong to them, but which speaks on behalf of the complex. Therefore, the impulse to isolate oneself can be a self-preservation instinct against psychic fragmentation. It is the soul saying, if I open myself up now, I will be swallowed by my own complex. I need solitude to gather myself before facing the world. It is a fatal mistake to treat the complex as an enemy to be destroyed. It must be recognized and integrated. But for that, an environment of silence and introspection is necessary. External noise, social demands, the performance of the persona, all of this keeps the complex in the shadows, where it can operate most effectively and consume us. When an individual finally yields to the impulse of solitude, he is, in fact, performing an act of psychic hygiene. He is avoiding the signal degradation race of his consciousness. He is saying, I refuse to be a puppet of my unresolved past. In this context, solitude becomes the testing ground where the ego attempts to regain control over its own kingdom. It is not the guest we are rejecting, We are rejecting the power that the complex exerts over us through the external trigger. It is a social sacrifice in the name of inner integrity. Embrace resistance. It's not a flaw, it's a symptom, and every symptom is the language of the unconscious. Listen to it, for it's pointing to the complex that needs to be confronted, not in the living room, but in the basement of your own psyche. The final battle is always internal. Isolation, when imposed by the need to regroup psychic energy, is an act of wisdom. But it is necessary to be clear. Solitude is a training ground, not a permanent refuge. If the individual confuses the temporary need for withdrawal with a lifelong refusal to engage with the external world, he is no longer protecting himself. He is building the most sophisticated of prisons. This is the trap where childhood neurosis manifests itself with the greatest virulence. The complex, once calmed by silence, whispers the promise of absolute security. It seduces the ego into remaining in the stage of the puer aeternus, the eternal child, who desires unlimited potential without the responsibility of actualization. The puer yearns for pre-social innocence, a state where boundaries are fluid and the demands of the adult world do not penetrate. That is why the unexpected visit, the ringing of the doorbell, is so unsettling. The visitor is not just a person, he is the harbinger of the reality principle. He represents the demand that the individual emerge from his cocoon and don the armor of the mature persona, assuming the burden of being a separate, complete, and therefore vulnerable being. The persistent refusal to open the door is not merely a symptom of introversion. It may be a manifestation of the refusal to abandon childhood neurosis, the fear that, by exposing oneself, the fragility of the ego will be revealed. We prefer the safety of known suffering, the irritation and exhaustion caused by the visitor, to facing the fundamental anguish of adult existence, which is being alone at the center of the self. The journey of individuation, the path to becoming who you truly are, demands a price. And that price is sacrifice. It's not about sacrificing the other, but about sacrificing out oneself, or rather, the childish and self-dependent version of oneself. It's necessary to burn on the altar of consciousness the illusion that life can be lived in a state of uninterrupted purity and protection. Neurosis is the suffering of the soul that refuses to pay this price, that tries to negotiate with fate, seeking a third way where integrity can be maintained without the risk of contact. But psychic life is a tension of opposites. Health lies not in eliminating conflict, but in the ability to endure it. The individual must learn to receive the external guest without their inner world collapsing. The challenge is not to close the door, but rather to strengthen the inner wall so that it is not invaded, even when the physical door is open. He who hides eternally behind the door, even if he does so in the name of inner peace, is condemned to stagnation. He preserves energy, yes, but for what purpose? Psychic energy, when not invested in life and in confronting the external world, becomes sterile and turns against the individual, manifesting as depression, anxiety, or destructive projections. Growth demands that the ego, which has spent enough time gathering its complexes in silence, now take them to the marketplace, to the battlefield of daily life. The discomfort felt when receiving someone is the necessary friction that reveals where we are still stuck. It is the ignition point where the old neurosis, the fear of judgment or invasion, tries to regain control. The choice is brutal and unavoidable. You can remain the architect of ruins, inhabiting a temple that is never ready to be visited, or you can accept the responsibility of being the master of your own home, capable of welcoming the outside world without being dismantled by it. True strength lies not in avoiding confrontation, but in being so rooted in the self that the presence of the other no longer represents a threat of fragmentation. The integrated individual knows that the visitor's energy can touch, but cannot possess. He can maintain the integrity of his sacred space even amidst social noise. Therefore, the impulse to close the door must be rigorously analyzed. Is it a temporary survival instinct or the chronic manifestation of existential cowardice? The difference is that survival leads to individuation. Cowardice leads to neurotic isolation. Conscience is a burden, a heavy load that adults must bear, and this burden includes the pain of exposure, the inconvenience of interruption, and the need to deal with otherness. To flee from this demand is to choose a small life in exchange for a false peace. The great life, the one demanded by your destiny, is always dangerous. And the first step to living it is to open the door, not because you want to, but because the soul demands the risk. The work of the psyche is never finished. The door of your house is ultimately the threshold between your inner world and the totality of the collective unconscious, and both need to be confronted. This is therefore not a simple matter of etiquette or social preference. We are facing a profound calling, the demand of the self for the individual to become what he or she is destined to be. Modern neurosis is not merely the result of unresolved traumas, but of the refusal to accept this totality. When we avoid encounters with others, we are, in fact, avoiding confrontation with the parts of ourselves that we project onto the outside world. The unexpected visitor is not just a person. They are the bearer of a strangeness, of an otherness that threatens the meticulous order we have established in our inner world. If your universe collapses simply because someone rings the doorbell, it indicates that the foundation of your psyche is still fragile, dependent on a sterile isolation to maintain the illusion of peace. The path of individuation does not allow for permanent refuge. It demands that the individual integrate opposites, the need for seclusion for inner recharging, and the need for exposure to test reality. Strength lies not in avoiding friction, but in developing a psychic membrane robust enough to filter external energy without being torn by it. The solution is not to force a sociability that drains the soul. That would be repression, and repression only fattens the shadow. Integration lies in the ability to establish conscious boundaries and to use the persona not as a mask of falsehood, but as a tactical and temporary shield. Introverts must learn the art of dosing. A visit doesn't need to last for hours. The encounter can be brief but authentic. A small, genuine contact, where you respect your time limit, is better than prolonged social exhaustion that leads you to hate others and yourself. Protecting the temple of the soul means knowing when to close the door, and, crucially, knowing when to open it for a calculated moment. The individual who knows himself deeply does not fear interruption, for he knows he can return to his center at any time. He becomes the master of his house, not its prisoner. The guilt felt when desiring solitude is an echo of the voice of the mass, which idolizes noise and condemns silence. But silence is the laboratory of the psyche. It is where alchemical gold is forged. The individual who honors their inner temple, who protects their sacred space, is not fleeing the world. They are preparing to bear the weight of the world. The journey of individuation is solitary by nature, where no one can do the work of your soul for you. You are solely responsible for integrating your complexes and confronting your shadow. Therefore, if this analysis resonated with your deepest nature, if you recognize the subtle architecture of your own complexes in the discomfort of the closed door, then the work has begun. The psyche demands rigor and courage. If your self is calling you to silence, listen. But know that silence is only the prelude to the next confrontation, the next threshold. Man's destiny is not peace, but growth. And growth is always painful, always dangerous, and always requires you to sacrifice the security of the known for the uncertainty of totality. The individual must take risks. The closed door is sometimes not a shield, but a cage. Life awaits you outside, ready to challenge the integrity you have spent so much time building. Accept the challenge. Confronting social discomfort is confronting yourself, and that is the only path to wholeness.